The knock came like a gavel striking wood. 3 hard raps, then a 4th for good measure. Lyra did not need to open the door to know who stood behind it. She had been dreading that particular knock for 11 days, ever since the landlord's boy had come sniffing around, asking when the rent might be settled. She wiped a smear of cadmium yellow from her thumb onto her apron and crossed the narrow attic room, her boots creaking against floorboards that had not seen a proper scrubbing since the summer. When she pulled the door open, she found herself looking not at the landlord, but at a man she had never once seen in Spitalfields in all her 32 years of living there. He was tall, dressed in a wool coat so finely tailored it seemed almost an insult to the peeling wallpaper behind her, and he carried himself the way men carried themselves when they had never once been told to wait their turn. Behind him stood a heavier fellow with a leather satchel of papers and the flat, bored expression of a man who did this sort of work often. "Miss Lyra Hartwell?" the tall man asked, though it did not sound like a question so much as a formality he intended to dispense with quickly. "Who's asking?" "Duke Alden of Ashcombe." He said it the way other men might say the time of day. "You are 3 months behind on rent owed to this property, which, as of last quarter, belongs to my estate. My bailiff here carries the eviction warrant. I'd advise you not to make this difficult." Lyra felt her stomach drop, though her face gave away nothing. She had faced worse men than this over the years, landlords who threatened, moneylenders who sneered, critics who laughed at her canvases in the street markets of Whitechapel. She was not about to crumble before a duke simply because he wore his arrogance like a second coat. "I have 3 days' grace under the tenancy law, sir, and I intend to use every hour of it." "You have exactly as much grace as I am willing to extend, Miss Hartwell, and at present that amounts to none at all." He stepped past her into the room without invitation, his boots striking the floor with the confidence of a man who had never once doubted his right to walk wherever he pleased. The attic smelled of turpentine and linseed oil, thick enough that the Duke's nose wrinkled slightly, though he said nothing of it. Canvases leaned against every wall, some finished, most half-formed, studies of dock workers, flower sellers, a bruised sky over the Thames. The bailiff began reading aloud from his papers in a flat, practiced drone about lawful possession and forfeiture of goods. Lyra barely heard him. Her eyes were fixed on the Duke, who had begun to move through her studio with the slow, assessing gaze of a man cataloguing what he intended to sell. It happened in an instant, the way disasters often do. As he turned to address his bailiff, the trailing edge of his coat caught the corner of a cotton drop-cloth draped over an easel near the window, the one piece in the entire room Lyra had never allowed anyone to look at. The cloth slid from the canvas and pooled on the floor in a soft heap. The Duke went very still. Beneath the cloth stood an unfinished oil portrait, a young woman's face rendered in careful, loving strokes, her expression caught somewhere between sorrow and peace. Around her throat, painted with a precision Lyra had spent weeks perfecting, hung a gold filigree pendant, set with a sapphire cut in a manner no jeweller in Spitalfields could have imagined, let alone described. "Where?" the Duke said, and his voice had changed entirely, gone low and taut as a drawn wire. "Did you see that pendant?" Lyra frowned, confused by the sudden violence beneath his composure. "I painted it from memory, Your Grace. It belonged to someone I once knew." "That is not possible." He crossed the room in 3 strides and stood before the canvas, staring at it the way a man stares at a ghost. His gloved hand rose, hovering an inch from the paint, as though he feared touching it might make the image vanish. "That pendant was stolen 15 years ago on the Kent Road the night my sister was finished. It has not been seen since. No sketch of it exists outside my family's private papers." He turned to face her, and whatever hardness had lived in his eyes moments before had been replaced by something raw and unguarded. Grief wearing the mask of suspicion. "You will tell me, this instant, how a woman selling paintings out of a Spitalfields garret came to know the face of a ducal heirloom that vanished before you were old enough to remember it. And you will tell me the truth, Miss Hartwell, because I promise you, I have not come here today for rent." Behind him, the bailiff lowered his papers slowly, sensing that whatever business had brought them through that door, It was no longer the one written upon them. 3 days passed before Lyra saw the inside of a carriage that did not belong to a rag and bone man. She had spent those days under a kind of house arrest that never called itself that. A maid brought her meals. A footman stood outside her door at the inn where the Duke had lodged her, polite but immovable. On the third morning, the same carriage that had carried her from Spitalfields returned to take her to Mayfair, and this time there was no bailiff riding beside her, only her own thoughts, circling like gulls over a fish market. The manor was nothing like she had imagined a duke's house might be. She had pictured marble and gilt, something cold and boastful. Instead, she was led through a hallway of dark oak panelling into a library thick with the smell of old leather and pipe smoke, gas lamps burning low against the grey afternoon pressing at the windows. Velvet curtains, heavy as church drapery, hung either side of a window that looked out over a garden gone brown with autumn. Alden was already seated when she entered, though he rose the moment the door opened, a habit of manners that seemed to fight against the suspicion still written plainly across his face. "Sit, Miss Hardwell." She sat. The chair was mahogany, hard beneath her, and she was suddenly conscious of the paint stains under her fingernails, the darned patch at her elbow. She folded her hands in her lap and waited. "I have spent 3 days making inquiries," Alden said, pacing rather than sitting himself. "Do you know what I have learned? Nothing. No record of a Lyra Hartwell connected to any fence, any pawnbroker, any receiver of stolen goods operating between here and the Kent coast. And yet you painted my sister's pendant with such accuracy that my own mother wept upon seeing the sketch I made from memory of your canvas." "I told you the truth already," Lyra said. "I painted it from memory too." "Then whose memory, Miss Hartwell? Because it was not yours. You could not have laid eyes on that jewel unless you were somehow connected to the men who took it from her throat the night they finished her on the Kent road." Something in Lyra's chest went tight and cold. "What do you mean?" 15 years ago. She was 17. Highwaymen stopped our family's carriage returning from Rochester. My father survived. My mother survived. My sister did not. His voice had gone rough at the edges, though he seemed determined not to let it break entirely. She was taken from us in the space of a single night, and that pendant was the last thing anyone ever saw her wearing. Lyra sat very still, working backward through years she had tried for a long time not to revisit. "Your Grace, when did this happen? The exact month, if you know it." "September, 1873. The room seemed to tilt very slightly around her. "I was 19 that autumn," she said slowly. "I worked as a seamstress in a tenement house off Fournier Street. There was a girl who came to us in November of that year, thin, feverish, her clothes torn beyond mending. She never gave her name. She would only say that men had left her and that she could not go home." Alden had stopped pacing entirely. She wore that pendant beneath her shift, hidden against her skin, as though it were the only thing left connecting her to whoever she had been before. I nursed her through that winter. She would not see a physician. She was terrified of anyone asking questions, terrified of the men who had hurt her finding her again. I never learned her true name. She only ever called herself Nell. Lyra's voice caught. "She died in March, in my arms, in a room no bigger than this fireplace. I painted her afterward, from memory, because I could not bear the thought that no one on this earth would remember her face." The silence that followed was so complete that Lyra could hear the coals settling in the grate. "Nell," Alden repeated, as though testing the shape of the word in his mouth. "Her Christian name was Eleanor. My mother called her Nell when she was small." He sat down heavily in the chair opposite Lyra, all the hardness gone out of him at once, like a wall that had finally given way after years of quiet erosion. "She survived. She survived that night on the Kent road, and she spent her final months of life starving in a Spitalfields garret while my family scoured every port and every thieves' den in London, believing her taken by traffickers, believing her sold off to some foreign shore, believing anything but the truth, that she was close enough to walk to, dying of cold within a mile of our own townhouse, and none of us ever thought to look." He pressed a hand over his eyes. Lyra had expected many things from this meeting: accusation, perhaps arrest, perhaps a demand for money she did not have. She had not expected to watch a Duke of the Realm come undone in front of her like a man twice his age. "I am sorry," she said quietly, because there was truly nothing else to offer him. "I did everything I knew how to do for her. It was not enough. I have carried that with me every day since." Alden lowered his hand. When he looked at her again, the suspicion had drained entirely from his face, replaced by something far harder to name. Grief, certainly, but also a strange, aching gratitude, the look of a man realizing that a stranger had given his sister a kindness his own family had failed to provide. "You gave her a winter she did not have to spend alone," he said. "You gave her a face that will outlast both of us. I came to your door 3 days ago to seize your studio for unpaid rent, Miss Hartwell." His voice had steadied, though something had shifted permanently behind his eyes. "I find now that I owe you a debt no rent in the world could settle." The offer came the following week, delivered not by letter, but by Alden himself, standing in the doorway of the inn-room with his hat in his hands, like a man unsure of his welcome. "I will not seize your studio," he said. "I want that understood plainly, so you need not wonder at my intentions. But I have a proposal, if you are willing to hear it." Lyra folded her arms, wary despite herself. "Go on, Your Grace." "The portrait. Finish it. Not in that attic where the light fails you by 3 in the afternoon and the damp will ruin the canvas within a year, but here, in Mayfair, where I can offer you proper materials and a room built for the purpose. I will pay you a commission worthy of the work, enough to clear your debts twice over and set you up somewhere better besides. In exchange, when it is finished, it hangs in the family gallery, where she belongs." It was, Lyra had to admit, an offer no sensible woman in her position would refuse. Her debts had not vanished simply because a duke had wept in front of her. The attic still waited, cold and threatened, and the commission would settle matters she had lain awake over for months. And yet something in her hesitated, a reluctance to be folded so quickly into the household of a man whose world was built from an entirely different cloth than her own. "I accept," she said finally, "on the condition that the work remains mine to direct. I'll not have footmen hovering over my shoulder telling me how a duchess ought to look." A faint, unexpected smile crossed his face. "Agreed." The room they gave her was a conservatory at the rear of the house, glass-walled and filled with ferns and winter roses that someone kept alive through careful and constant attention. Sunlight poured through the panes in a way no Spittlefield's garret could ever manage, falling across the half-finished canvas until the paint seemed to glow from within. Lyra set up her easel near the largest window and lost herself, for the first time in months, in nothing but the work. Alden began visiting in the late afternoons, always with some excuse. A question about the household accounts that could easily have waited, a book he thought she might find useful for reference, though she never once asked for one. He would stand a respectful distance from the easel, hands clasped behind his back, watching her mix colors on her palette with the quiet fascination of a man who had never before been permitted to see how a thing of beauty was actually made. "You work as though you're arguing with the canvas," he observed one afternoon, watching her scrape away a passage of shadow she had just laid down. "I am," she said, without looking up. "It rarely listens." "Does it ever win?" "Constantly. That's the trouble with painting someone from memory, Your Grace. The memory keeps changing its mind about what it wants to remember." He was quiet a moment, then said, "Call me Alden when we are here. The title grows tiresome after enough repetition." She glanced at him then, surprised, and found him watching her with an expression she could not immediately place. Not the hard suspicion of their first meeting, nor quite the raw grief of the library, but something gentler, curious, unguarded in a way she suspected very few people in his life were ever permitted to witness. Their afternoons settled into a quiet rhythm over the following fortnight. He would arrive between his parliamentary duties, often still in his formal coat, and they would take tea among the ferns while she let a layer of paint dry. He spoke, in careful pieces, of the weight of a title he had never wanted and inherited too young, of a mother who had aged a decade in the year following his sister's disappearance, of the endless obligations that filled his days with meetings and correspondence and left almost nothing that felt like his own. Lyra found herself telling him things in return she had not spoken aloud in years, of her own mother's death when she was a girl, of the years spent learning her craft from a printmaker in Clerkenwell who paid her in scraps of canvas rather than coin, of the particular loneliness of a life spent watching others through a window rather than living inside the room herself. "You make it sound as though we've swapped cages," Alden said one evening, the winter roses pale and ghostly in the fading light. "Yours built of poverty, mine of duty." "Perhaps we have," Lyra said, "though I imagine yours comes with better heating." He laughed then, a real laugh, surprised out of him, and for a moment the careful distance between Duke and artist thinned to something far less certain. It was during one such evening, as she worked at the fine gold detail of the pendant chain, that she noticed him watching not the painting, but her hands, the steady, patient way she guided the brush across canvas that had once been a stranger's memory and was slowly becoming something else entirely, a shared grief, tended by two people who had never expected to find comfort in each other. "I used to think," Alden said quietly, "that a house this large could never feel so empty. I have learned otherwise these past years. It is strange, Miss Hartwell, how a room full of ferns and one working easel has come to feel less lonely than a house full of servants." Lyra did not answer immediately. She set down her brush and looked at him properly. This man who had come to seize her studio and instead had somehow, without either of them quite noticing the moment it happened, become the person whose company she most looked forward to each day. "The portrait is nearly finished," she said instead, because it was easier than saying what she truly meant. "Another fortnight, perhaps less." Something flickered across his face, not disappointment exactly, but a shadow of it, the recognition that whatever this arrangement had become, it carried a natural endpoint drawing steadily nearer. "Then, I suppose," he said, "we ought to make good use of the time remaining." The invitation arrived on heavy cream paper, sealed with the crest of the Royal Academy, and Lyra turned it over in her hands 3 times before she believed it was truly meant for her. "An evening exhibition," Alden explained, "at Burlington House. Several of my acquaintances will be showing sketches and studies. I thought you might come as my guest." "Your Grace," she began, already shaking her head. "Alden," he corrected, "and I have already decided. You'll not talk me out of it." She went, in the end, dressed in a gown of dark silk he had arranged to be made for her, modest, well cut, nothing that shouted wealth but nothing that betrayed poverty either. It was, she understood without being told, a costume meant to protect her from the particular cruelty of drawing rooms, where a woman's worth was measured first by her clothing and only afterward, if at all, by anything she might actually have to say. Burlington House glittered that evening with candlelight and conversation, the great rooms crowded with silk gowns and tailored coats, the low murmur of voices rising and falling beneath paintings hung floor to ceiling in gilt frames. Lyra kept close to Alden's side, aware of the glances that followed them, some curious, some openly disapproving, the particular chill reserved for a stranger who did not belong and yet had somehow arrived on the arm of a duke. She did not notice the man watching from beside a marble pillar until Alden stiffened beside her. "My uncle," he murmured, low enough that only she could hear. "Lord Beaufort. He manages a portion of the estate accounts. Be civil, but be brief." Beaufort approached with the easy, practiced smile of a man who had spent decades in rooms exactly like this one. He was older than Alden by perhaps 20 years, silver-haired, dressed with the particular restraint that wealthy men affected when they wished to appear above the vanity of fashion. "Alden, and this must be the artist I've heard whispered of all evening." His eyes moved over Lyra with a courtesy so smooth it felt almost like a blade sliding free of its sheath. "Miss Hartwell, is it? I understand you've undertaken a rather significant commission for the family." "I have, my lord." "A portrait of poor Eleanor, I'm told. How very touching after all these years." His gaze drifted, almost carelessly, toward the portfolio of preliminary sketches Lyra carried beneath her arm, studies she had brought at Alden's request to show a fellow painter later that evening. "May I?" Before she could object, he had drawn the topmost sketch free and was studying it beneath the candlelight, a careful study of the pendant itself, rendered from several angles, with small notations in Lyra's own hand marking the particular cut of the sapphire and the pattern of the gold filigree. Something shifted behind Beaufort's eyes, so briefly that Lyra might have imagined it had she not been watching closely. A flicker of alarm swiftly smoothed over. "Remarkable detail," he said, handing the sketch back to her with a smile that did not quite reach his eyes. "You must have studied the original piece a great many times to render it with such precision." "I painted it from memory of the woman who wore it, my lord, nothing more." "Of course." He inclined his head. "And where precisely did the two of you first meet? The girl and yourself, I mean. Alden tells me it was some tenement house, though he was vague on the particulars. I find myself curious as to the district, the date. History interests me, Miss Hartwell. One never knows what small detail might prove significant." Lyra glanced at Alden, uncertain why the question set her nerves on edge, though she could not have named the reason. "Fournier Street, my lord, November of 1873. "How precise your memory is." Beaufort's smile widened, though something colder moved beneath it. "A pleasure, truly. I shall look forward to seeing the finished portrait." He bowed shallowly to them both and withdrew into the crowd, his silver head disappearing among the throng of silk and candlelight. Alden let out a slow breath once his uncle had gone. "I apologize. He can be particular in company." He asked a great many questions for a man merely curious about history. "He manages the estate's older accounts. I suppose old habits of scrutiny die hard in a man who has spent his life auditing ledgers." Alden said it lightly, though Lyra noticed he did not entirely relax until they had moved to the far side of the gallery, well clear of his uncle's reach. But Lyra could not shake the memory of that flicker in Beaufort's eyes. Not curiosity, she was certain now, but something closer to fear, quickly mastered and hidden away behind good breeding and an easy smile. She thought of the date she had given him, the district, the precision he had praised so warmly, and wondered, with a small, cold unease she could not quite explain, why a man who claimed no more than a passing historical interest should need those details so exactly. Across the crowded gallery, unseen by either of them, Lord Beaufort stood near a tall window, a glass of claret untouched in his hand, his gaze fixed on nothing in particular, while his mind worked through the arithmetic of a 15-year silence now threatening to break. He had built his position, his influence over the estate, his very freedom, upon the assumption that certain truths had been buried on the Kent road, along with a girl the world believed vanished without trace. A seamstress with too precise a memory and too many careful sketches was not, he had decided, a threat he could afford to leave unattended. By the time the carriages began departing Burlington House that night, Beaufort had already sent word to a man he kept for matters requiring discretion rather than ceremony. Instructions delivered quietly, in the manner of a debt long overdue and finally, regrettably, coming due. 3 days after the exhibition, Lyra returned to Wapping alone. She had told no one where she was going, not even the maid who had grown accustomed to her comings and goings at the manor. It seemed, somehow, a private errand, one that belonged to the version of herself who had lived in Spitalfields, not the version now dressed in silk and sleeping beneath a duke's roof. Her old landlord had written to say that a storage room near the docks, once used to keep her few remaining belongings when she'd first arrived in London penniless, was finally to be cleared for a new tenant. If she wanted anything from it, she had best come collect it before the week was out. She had almost forgotten the room existed, but somewhere inside it, she remembered now, was a small chest that had belonged to Nell, the few possessions the girl had carried with her that terrible November, kept safe by Lyra all these years because she had never been able to bring herself to part with them, nor quite bring herself to look through them properly either. The warehouse stood at the end of a narrow lane running down toward the river, timber-built and leaning slightly with age, the smell of tar and damp wood thick in the autumn air. Gulls wheeled overhead, crying against a sky gone the color of dull pewter. Lyra let herself in with the key the landlord had provided and made her way through stacked crates and forgotten furniture to the small storage room at the rear, where a single trunk sat exactly where she had left it years before. Inside, beneath a moth-eaten shawl, she found what she was looking for, a small brass locket casing, tarnished with age, its clasp long since broken. She turned it over in her hands, remembering the weight of it against Nell's chest in those final feverish weeks, and did not at first notice the smell of smoke drifting in from beyond the storage room door. By the time she did notice, it was already thickening into something she could taste at the back of her throat. She stepped out into the main warehouse to find the far end already engulfed, orange light licking hungrily up stacked timber and old rope, smoke pooling thick and black against the rafters. The single door she had entered through stood beyond the spreading flame, and for one long, terrible moment, Lyra understood with perfect clarity that she had been left no clear path back to it. She had not seen the men who set the fire, nor heard them slip away into the lane outside once their work was done. They had been quick, professional, the sort of men who did such things often enough to know precisely how little time a witness needed to realize her danger. Lyra pressed the locket into her apron pocket and pulled her shawl up over her mouth, coughing as she pushed through a haze of smoke toward a side window she remembered from years before, half-boarded but not entirely sealed. She wrenched at the loose plank with hands that shook more than she wanted to admit, splinters driving into her palms, the roar of the fire growing louder behind her with every passing second. It was the sound of hooves on cobblestone, sharp and urgent even through the growing chaos, that reached her before the plank finally gave way. Alden had learned of her whereabouts from his butler not an hour after she'd left the manor, the old man mentioning, almost in passing, that Miss Hartwell had asked directions to a storage warehouse near Wapping Docks belonging to her former landlord. Something in the casual mention had settled uneasily in Alden's chest. The memory of his uncle's too careful questions at the exhibition, the flicker of alarm he had chosen, foolishly, to dismiss as nothing. He had called for his horse before he had fully reasoned out why. He arrived to find smoke pouring from the warehouse windows and no crowd yet gathered to raise the alarm, the lane still empty save for the hiss and crackle of flame consuming old timber. He was off his horse and through the door before he had properly considered the danger, shielding his face with his forearm as heat rolled over him in a solid wave. "Lyra!" Her answering cough, somewhere deeper in the smoke, was the sweetest sound he had ever heard. He found her half-collapsed near the side window, the loose plank finally torn free, but the gap too narrow, her strength failing as smoke thickened around her. He swept his heavy wool cloak from his shoulders and pressed it over her mouth and nose, hauling her upright with an arm around her waist. "Can you walk?" "I can try." "Then try quickly." He kept her pressed close against him, using his own body to shield her from the worst of the heat, and half-carried, half-dragged her back through the warehouse toward the door they had both entered by, flame now licking along the beams above their heads. The roof groaned, timber cracking somewhere overhead with a sound like a gunshot, and Alden did not slow, did not hesitate, simply pulled her forward through smoke and heat until the cold evening air struck them both like a blessing. They had barely cleared the doorway, stumbling together into the lane, when the roof gave way behind them entirely, a great collapsing roar of timber and sparks lighting the darkening sky. Lyra sank to her knees on the cobblestones, coughing violently, and Alden knelt beside her, still holding her, his own face streaked black with soot, his hands trembling now that the danger had passed. "You could have been ended," he said, his voice raw, whether from smoke or fear she could not tell. "Lyra, you could have died in there, and I would never have—" He did not finish the sentence. He did not need to. He simply held her against him in the smoke-thick lane, the warehouse burning behind them, and neither of them spoke again until the fire bell somewhere in the distance began, finally, to ring. Alden moved her to Surrey the following morning, before the ash from the warehouse had even finished settling over Wapping. "It was no accident," he told her, as the carriage rattled south along roads still slick with early frost. I have made enough inquiries in one night to know that much for certain. A watchman 2 streets over saw men leaving the lane minutes before the fire took hold. That warehouse did not simply catch Lyra, it was set. She sat wrapped in blankets beside him, her hands bandaged where the splinters had torn her skin raw, and said nothing for a long moment, watching the city give way slowly to hedgerows and bare autumn fields. Who would want a storage room of old rags burned to the ground? No one, Alden said grimly, which tells me it was never the warehouse they wanted destroyed. It was you. The country house at Ashcombe stood at the end of a long gravel drive lined with elms stripped bare for winter, grey stone softened by ivy that had not yet let go its last green leaves. Lyra had expected grandeur to match Mayfair, but the Surrey estate carried a different character altogether. Quieter, older, the kind of house that had settled comfortably into its own history rather than straining to announce it. She spent the first days in bed under the watchful care of the estate physician, a mild, elderly man named Dr. Whitfield, who tended the burns along her forearms with a gentleness that reminded her, unexpectedly, of the way she had once tended Nell through her final illness. Alden visited each morning and each evening, always with some small excuse, a book, a question about her comfort, news of the ongoing search for whoever had set the fire, though Lyra came to understand, within a few days, that the excuses mattered far less to him than simply being permitted to sit beside her bed a while. The magistrate has found nothing, he admitted one evening, drawing a chair close to the fire that crackled low in the grate of her room. No one in Wapping will speak of what they saw. Fear, likely, or coin changing hands to buy their silence. Whoever arranged this understood precisely how to cover his tracks. You suspect someone in particular? It was not a question. Alden was quiet a long moment, staring into the fire. I do not wish to suspect him, but my uncle's questions at the exhibition sit poorly with me now, turned over enough times in my mind. The dates, the district. I dismissed it as an old man's idle curiosity. I begin to think I was a fool to dismiss anything at all. Lord Beaufort. He manages the older estate accounts, has done since before I came of age. I have never once had cause to question his honesty, and I find I do not wish to begin now, not without proof. He rubbed a hand over his face, weary in a way Lyra had not seen from him before, not even in the library the day he learned the truth of his sister's fate. But a man does not send thugs to burn a warehouse over idle curiosity, Lyra. Something in what you know frightens him. She did not have an answer for that, not yet. And so instead, she reached across the small distance between them and took his hand, the first time she had done so without his hand reaching for hers first. He looked down at their joined fingers, hers still faintly scarred, his stained with ink from the letters he had spent half the night writing to men who might help uncover the truth. And something in his shoulders eased, as though her touch alone had loosened a knot he had been carrying since the fire. As the days passed and her strength returned, they took to walking the frosted gardens each evening before supper, well wrapped against the cold, their breath clouding in the fading light. The estate library became their favoured refuge on colder evenings, a warm, book-lined room where Alden would read aloud while Lyra sketched by the fire, her bandaged hands finally steady enough again to hold a pencil. I have spent my whole life believing duty and warmth could not exist in the same room together, Alden told her one such evening, closing the book he had been reading without finishing the chapter. My father taught me that a duke's heart belonged first to his estate, his tenants, his obligations, and only afterward, if there was anything left over, to himself. I do not think there was ever anything left over, in his case. I thought perhaps there never would be, in mine. And now? Now I find myself counting the hours until supper, because it means I shall see you again, and I no longer know what to do with a feeling that large. He looked at her directly, firelight catching the grey of his eyes. You risked your life for a finished girl's memory and a locket no one else would have thought worth saving. You have shown more loyalty to a stranger than half the men in my acquaintance show their own blood. I do not know how to tell you what that has done to me, Lyra, except to say that this house has not felt warm in 15 years, and it does now. Lyra set down her pencil, her heart beating strangely fast. "Alden, I am not asking anything of you tonight," he said quickly, gently. "I only wished you to know it. Whatever comes of Beaufort, whatever danger still follows us, I wanted you to know that plainly, in case I do not find the courage to say it again." She reached for his hand a second time, and this time neither of them let go for a long while. The fire burning low between them, the frost outside deepening across gardens that had, for the first time in longer than either could easily admit, begun to feel like something worth calling home. It was Dr. Whitfield, of all people, who suggested she finally open the brass locket casing properly. "You've carried that thing about for days without so much as prying the clasp," he remarked, changing the dressing on her forearm one grey morning. "Whatever's inside can hardly bite you, Miss Hartwell." Lyra had avoided it, if she was honest with herself, out of a reluctance she could not fully explain. Some old superstitious fear that opening the last thing Nell had ever carried might somehow disturb whatever peace the girl had finally found. But the doctor's blunt practicality shamed her into action, and that afternoon, seated in the estate library with the fire burning low, she finally worked the tarnished clasp free with the point of a hairpin. The locket casing itself held nothing but a curl of faded ribbon, brittle with age. It was only when Lyra turned the small brass shell over in her hands, examining the lining out of idle curiosity, that she noticed the stitching along one edge had come loose, revealing a thin fold of paper tucked beneath the fabric. She drew it out carefully, her fingers trembling slightly, and unfolded a small ticket, water-stained and creased from years pressed flat, bearing the printed heading of a pawnbroker's shop in Whitechapel and a date 13 years past. "Alden." He was at her side within moments, drawn by something in her voice she had not intended to let show. He took the ticket from her outstretched hand and read it twice, his brow furrowing. "A pawn ticket, dated barely a month before you told me you found her." He looked up. "Why would Nell have kept such a thing hidden in her locket?" "I don't know, but a pawnbroker keeps a registry, does he not? A record of every transaction, buyer and seller both." Lyra's pulse had quickened. "If this ticket corresponds to an entry in that registry, it may tell us who redeemed whatever was pawned, and when." Alden was already reaching for the bell pull. Within the hour, his trusted valet, a quiet, capable man named Harmon, who had served the family for over a decade, was riding for London with instructions to locate the shop named on the ticket and inspect its records, however far back they might need to search. The wait stretched into 2 anxious days. Lyra found herself unable to settle to her sketching, pacing the library instead, while Alden attended to a mountain of correspondence he could not seem to properly focus on either. When Harmon finally returned, road-worn and travel-stained, he carried with him a leather-bound ledger borrowed under considerable persuasion from the pawnbroker himself, along with a folded copy of the relevant page. Alden spread it across the library table, and the three of them bent over it together in the lamplight. The entry was plain enough, once they found the corresponding date: a sapphire pendant, gold filigree setting, pawned in October of 1873 by a woman whose description matched no one Lyra recognized, and redeemed 3 weeks later by payment drawn against a private account. The account holder's name, written in the pawnbroker's careful copperplate hand, struck the room into silence. Lord Beaufort. "That cannot be right," Alden said, though his voice had gone very quiet, as though he already suspected otherwise. "My uncle would have had no cause to handle that pendant at all, let alone redeem it from a Whitechapel pawnshop under his own name." "Unless he knew precisely where it had come from," Lyra said slowly, working through the arithmetic of dates that had haunted her for years without ever quite resolving. "Nell arrived at my tenement in November, already ill, already frightened. If the pendant was pawned in October and redeemed weeks later by your uncle's own account, then he knew, Alden. He knew where that jewel had ended up. He knew, which likely means he knew where she had ended up as well." Alden sat down heavily, the ledger page still gripped in his hand. "He told my family for 15 years that he had exhausted every avenue searching for her. He sat at our table, year after year, watching my mother grieve, watching my father grow old under the weight of not knowing, and all the while—" He stopped, unable to finish the thought aloud. "He knew she was alive," Lyra said gently, though there was no gentle way to say it. "He knew, and he did nothing. Worse than nothing. If he could trace that pendant to a pawnshop and redeem it under his own name, he could have found her. He could have brought her home to be nursed by proper physicians, rather than a 19-year-old seamstress with nothing but rags and prayers to offer her. She might have lived, Alden, if he had simply told the truth." The full shape of it settled over the room like a weight neither of them could immediately lift. Lord Beaufort had not merely orchestrated the robbery that stole a duke's daughter from her family 15 years past. He had known, in the months that followed, precisely where that theft had led her, and had chosen silence over rescue, deliberately withholding the one truth that might have saved her, because a missing heiress presumed gone left him free to manage the estate's fortune unchallenged, his position secured by a grief he had engineered and then carefully, patiently, allowed to fester for 15 unbroken years. "He ended her as surely as if he'd held the pistol himself," Alden said finally, his voice flat with a fury too large to properly contain. "Withholding aid from a dying girl to protect his own position. My own uncle." He looked up at Lyra, something hard and resolute settling into his expression, the grief of the past days hardening now into purpose. "He must answer for this. Whatever it costs the family name, whatever scandal follows, he will answer for what he has done." Lyra reached across the table and closed her hand over his, steadying him the way she had once steadied a dying girl through a long and terrible winter. "Then we shall see that he does." Alden did not send word ahead to his uncle. He judged, rightly, that a man given warning had time enough to arrange an alibi, or worse, to flee altogether before the truth could be laid before him. Instead, he invited the wider family to Ashcombe under the pretense of an early autumn gathering, the kind of quiet occasion that had grown rare since his sister's disappearance years before. Lord Beaufort arrived on the appointed evening with his usual easy confidence, dressed in dark evening clothes, greeting the assembled relations with the same practiced warmth Lyra remembered from Burlington House. She watched him from across the drawing room, this man who had let a dying girl rot in poverty to protect his own fortunes, and found it difficult to reconcile his pleasant manner with the ledger page now folded carefully inside Alden's coat pocket. The gathering moved, as such family occasions traditionally did at Ashcombe, toward evening prayers in the small private chapel attached to the eastern wing of the house, a modest stone building with narrow leaded windows and a single row of family pews, candles already lit against the deepening dusk outside. It was there, as the assembled relations settled into their seats and the chaplain prepared to begin, that Alden rose instead and asked for a moment's indulgence. "Before we pray this evening," he said, his voice carrying clear and steady through the small stone chamber, "I find myself compelled to address a matter that has weighed upon this family for 15 years. He drew the folded ledger page from his coat and held it up for the room to see. "The truth of what happened to my sister Eleanor." A murmur moved through the assembled relations. Lord Beaufort's easy smile did not waver, though Lyra, watching closely, saw something flicker behind his eyes, the same flicker she had glimpsed at the exhibition, quickly suppressed. "Eleanor did not perish on the Kent road that night," Alden continued. "She survived the robbery, wounded and terrified, and made her way eventually to a tenement in Spitalfields, where she was nursed through a bitter winter by a kind stranger who knew nothing of who she truly was. She died there in March of the following year, in poverty, believing herself abandoned by a family who never once thought to search a mile from their own doorstep." "Alden," Beaufort said smoothly, rising from his pew, "this is hardly the occasion." "This ledger page," Alden pressed on, unmoved, "records a sapphire pendant pawned in a Whitechapel shop in October of that year and redeemed 3 weeks later against your private account, my lord. You knew where that pendant had come from. You knew, which means you knew where she was, or near enough to find her within days had you chosen to look. And you said nothing. For 15 years you sat at my mother's table and watched her grieve a daughter you could have restored to her, and you said nothing. Because a missing heiress left you free to manage this family's fortune without challenge. The chapel had gone utterly silent, every eye now fixed on Lord Beaufort, whose composure had finally, visibly, begun to crack. You cannot possibly believe the ravings of some common seamstress over the word of your own blood, Beaufort said, his voice sharpening, the pleasant mask slipping further with each word. A woman crawls out of Spitalfields with a forged story and a painted trinket, and you would ruin your own family's name on her say-so. She is lying to you, Alden, working some scheme with whoever helped her fake this document. The pawnbroker's own registry does not lie, my lord, Lyra said quietly, stepping forward from where she had stood near the chapel door. Nor does the date on that ticket, hidden for 13 years in a locket your niece wore against her skin until the day she died. Something in Beaufort's face changed entirely at that, the last of the smooth performance falling away, replaced by something cornered and desperate. His hand moved suddenly to his coat, and before anyone in the chapel could react, he had drawn a small pocket pistol, levelling it first at Alden, then, wavering, toward Lyra herself. Gasps rose through the assembled relations. Somewhere behind Lyra, a chair scraped back sharply. "You will destroy this family with your lies," Beaufort said, his voice shaking now, all pretense abandoned. "A commoner's forged story, ruining generations of noble standing." "Put down the pistol, uncle." Alden had gone very still, his eyes fixed steadily on the weapon rather than the man holding it. "Whatever comes of this, threatening your own family in a chapel will not save you." Lyra took a slow step forward, drawing Beaufort's wavering attention fully onto herself, her heart hammering, though her voice remained steady. "You did not come to that pawnshop by accident, my lord. You knew precisely what you were buying back, and precisely why. I have looked into the eyes of a dying girl who trusted no one, who was too frightened to even speak her own name for fear of what might follow her. I know exactly what fear like that looks like. It is looking at me now, from behind that pistol." For one long, terrible moment, Beaufort's hand trembled, the pistol's aim faltering as her words found their mark. It was the opening Alden needed. He crossed the space between them in 2 swift strides and seized his uncle's wrist, forcing the weapon upward and away as it discharged into the stone ceiling with a deafening crack that sent plaster raining down over the pews. The 2 men grappled briefly before Alden bore his uncle down onto the flagstone floor, pinning him there with the full weight of 15 years' grief finally given somewhere to land. Shouts rose through the chapel as estate grooms, alerted by the pistol's report, came running from the courtyard outside. And within minutes, Lord Beaufort had been hauled upright and restrained, his fine evening coat torn at the shoulder, his composure entirely gone. The local constable, summoned within the hour, took him into custody before the candles in the chapel had even finished burning down, charged with fraud, conspiracy, and a crime 15 years buried, finally dragged into the light. Winter passed slowly at Ashcombe, and then, almost without either of them noticing the change, it did not. Lord Beaufort's trial had been swift once the ledger and the pawnbroker's testimony were laid before the court, the scandal of it rippling through London society for a season before settling, as such scandals eventually did, into old news and quieter conversation. He was sentenced to a life term at Newgate for fraud and conspiracy, the crime charge tied to the warehouse fire proven through the testimony of one of his hired men, caught and persuaded to speak once he understood his master would not be returning to protect him. The Ashcombe name survived the affair more intact than anyone had dared hope, in part because Alden had insisted, from the very first day, on facing the truth publicly, rather than burying it as his uncle had once buried a dying girl's whereabouts. Lyra spent those winter months finishing the portrait properly, no longer working from stolen moments of memory, but from a settled, grieving peace that let her paint Nell's face with a tenderness the earlier drafts had lacked. She reworked the eyes 3 times before she judged them right, softened the line of the mouth until it held the exact quiet dignity she remembered from those final weeks. By the time the last brushstroke dried, in the pale light of a March afternoon, she knew without needing anyone to tell her that it was the finest work she had ever produced. The unveiling was set for a spring evening in the Mayfair townhouse. The great hall cleared of its usual furnishings and filled instead with gilt chairs and murmuring guests. Society patrons, fellow artists Alden had personally invited from the Royal Academy, family members who had, in the months since Beaufort's arrest, come slowly to understand what Lyra had done for a girl none of them had ever properly known how to search for. Lyra stood near the covered canvas in a gown of deep green silk, feeling the old, familiar nervousness of watching strangers prepare to judge her work, though it sat differently in her now than it once had. She was not the frightened seamstress bringing sketches to a printmaker for scraps of coin. She had painted a duke's sister back into the world, and whatever these assembled patrons thought of the result, she knew its worth herself. Alden stood beside her, dressed formally for the occasion, his hand resting lightly at the small of her back, in a gesture that had become, over the winter months, entirely natural between them. "Are you ready?" he asked quietly, beneath the murmur of the crowd. "I have been ready for 15 years, Lyra said. "I simply did not know it until now." At his signal, 2 footmen drew back the velvet cloth covering the canvas, and the great hall fell silent. The portrait that emerged was unlike anything the assembled guests had expected from whispered rumors of a Spitalfields artist and a scandal-touched commission. Eleanor gazed out from the canvas with quiet, luminous dignity, the sapphire pendant rendered in careful, glowing detail against her throat, her expression caught somewhere between the sorrow of all she had suffered and a peace that suggested, however briefly, she had known kindness before the end. It was not a portrait of a victim. It was a portrait of a young woman who had been loved, however imperfectly, and remembered with genuine tenderness. A ripple of quiet appreciation moved through the crowd, murmured praise for the brushwork, the composition, the extraordinary warmth captured in features none of them had ever known in life. Lyra caught the eye of an elderly Academy painter she recognized from her years selling canvases in the street markets, a man who had once dismissed her work as competent but unremarkable, and watched his expression shift now into something closer to genuine respect. It was Alden's mother, however, who moved everyone in the room to silence, stepping forward from among the family gathered near the front to stand before the finished canvas, one gloved hand rising slowly to cover her mouth. She had aged visibly in the years since her daughter's disappearance, grief carved permanently into features that had once, by all accounts, been considered among the finest in London society. She stood before the portrait for a long moment, tears sliding freely down her cheeks, before turning to find Lyra among the crowd. "You gave her back to me," the Duchess said simply, her voice trembling. "Not the girl I lost on the Kent Road, the girl she became, in her final months, who was cared for and loved by someone who owed her nothing at all. I do not know how to thank you for that, Miss Hartwell. I do not believe there are words sufficient to the debt." Lyra felt her own eyes sting, unexpected in front of so many watching strangers. "She deserved to be remembered as she truly was, Your Grace. I only wished to give her that much." Alden stepped forward then, raising his voice so it carried clearly across the hushed great hall, addressing not merely his mother, but every patron and society guest gathered to witness the unveiling. "I would have the assembled company understand something plainly this evening," he said, his hand finding Lyra's and holding it firm before the entire room. "Miss Hartwell is present tonight not as a hired artist, engaged and dismissed once her commission concludes. She is my honored guest, in this house and in this family, and I intend that understanding to remain unchanged long after this portrait has found its place upon these walls." A murmur ran through the crowd at that, curious and speculative, though Lyra scarcely noticed it, too caught up in the warmth of his hand around hers, the weight of an entire winter's grief, finally, properly, laid to rest before a room full of witnesses who could no longer pretend otherwise. 2 weeks after the unveiling, Alden proposed an afternoon drive through Hyde Park, the kind of ordinary outing that had, over the preceding months, become one of their favoured small pleasures, away from formal drawing rooms and curious guests, just the two of them, and the open sky. Spring had settled properly over London by then, the park's great elms budding green, riders and carriages moving along the well-worn paths in the loose, unhurried manner of a city finally shaking off winter. Lyra sat beside Alden in the open brougham, a light shawl about her shoulders against the breeze, watching the Serpentine glitter silver beneath the afternoon sun as swans drifted lazily near its banks. "You've been unusually quiet today," she observed, glancing sideways at him. He had said little since they'd set out, his attention drifting somewhere she could not quite follow. "I have been composing something in my head," he admitted, and finding the words considerably less obedient than I'd hoped. "That sounds like a confession of some kind." "Perhaps it is." He signaled the driver, and the carriage slowed, then stopped entirely near a quiet stretch of the lake where the path curved away from the busier thoroughfare, elm shadows dappling the grass around them. Alden climbed down and offered his hand to help her descend, and for a moment they simply stood together at the water's edge, watching the swans, the murmur of distant conversation and carriage wheels drifting past behind them. "I have spent this past winter," Alden said, finally, "reflecting on a great many things I once believed settled beyond question. That duty and happiness could not properly share the same roof. That a man of my position owed his heart first to obligation, and only ever second, if at all, to himself. That an arranged match to some suitable family, chosen for connections and estate boundaries rather than any real affection, was simply the natural order of things a duke must accept." Lyra said nothing, watching him carefully, her heart beginning to quicken though she could not yet be certain why. "I no longer believe any of that," he continued. "I have watched you walk into a burning warehouse for the memory of a girl who owed you nothing, and stand before a pistol in a chapel without once flinching, and paint grief into something that resembles hope rather than despair. I have watched you, Lyra, and I find I no longer wish for an arranged match, or a suitable family, or any of the cold obligations I once believed were owed to my name above everything else." He reached into his coat and drew out a small velvet box, and Lyra felt the breath catch entirely in her chest. "I have no desire," Alden said, opening it to reveal a ring set with a single sapphire, cut in a manner that echoed, deliberately she understood at once, the pendant that had first brought them together. "For a marriage that serves the estate and starves the man who inherits it. I want a wife whose independence I will celebrate rather than curtail, whose art will hang in this family's gallery not as a commissioned favor, but as her own standing achievement, and whose company I intend to seek out for the rest of my life, not from duty, but because I cannot properly imagine a single day without it." A pair of passing riders slowed their horses, curious, and further along the path a small cluster of afternoon strollers had begun to take notice, murmurs rising among them at the sight of the Duke of Ashcombe kneeling on the grass beside the Serpentine, a ring held out toward a woman in a plain grey shawl. Alden did not seem to notice them, or if he did not care. "Marry me, Lyra, not as the Duke who once came to your door with an eviction warrant, but as the man who has since learned that everything worth having in this life arrived because you refused to let him seize what he had no right to take. I love you. I have loved you, I think, since the moment I watched you defend a finished girl's memory against my own accusations without once backing down. Marry me, and let us build something neither of us ever expected to have." Lyra felt tears rising, unbidden, blurring the sight of him kneeling there before her, with a spring breeze stirring the elm leaves overhead. She thought of the cold attic in Spitalfields, the eviction warrant, the frightened girl she had nursed through a bitter winter so many years before, and understood, with sudden and complete clarity, that every hardship of that long road had led her, somehow, improbably, to this exact moment beside this exact man. "Yes," she said, her voice breaking on the single word. "Yes, Alden, I will marry you." He rose and gathered her into his arms as the small crowd of onlookers, no longer bothering to disguise their curiosity, broke into scattered applause, the murmurs shifting from speculation into open delight at having witnessed something rather more romantic than their usual afternoon in the park. Alden slid the ring onto her finger with hands that trembled slightly, and Lyra laughed through her tears at the sight of it. This careful, dutiful man reduced entirely to unguarded joy in front of half of fashionable London. "They will talk of nothing else for a month," she murmured against his shoulder, still laughing. "Let them talk," Alden said, drawing back just enough to look at her properly, his own eyes bright with an emotion he made no effort now to hide. "I have spent my whole life minding what society whispers behind gloved hands. I find, quite suddenly, that I no longer care in the slightest what any of them have to say." The swans drifted on, indifferent to the small commotion at the water's edge, while overhead the elms swayed gently in the warm spring air, and Lyra Hartwell, who had once feared losing everything to a duke's eviction warrant, stood instead in Hyde Park, wearing his ring, entirely, unexpectedly, home. Autumn came round again to Ashcombe, exactly 1 year to the week since a duke's carriage had first rattled up to a Spitalfields attic, bearing an eviction warrant neither of them would ever quite forget. The custom-built studio stood at the eastern edge of the estate gardens, its glass walls catching the low golden light of late October in a way the old conservatory never quite had. Purpose-built the previous spring, at Alden's insistence, once the wedding had settled into memory and married life had begun, in earnest, to find its own quiet rhythm. Lyra worked there most mornings now, surrounded by canvases in every stage of completion, the same turpentine smell that had once filled a cramped Spitalfields garret, drifting now through a room flooded with proper northern light and warmed, on colder days, by a small iron stove Alden had ordered installed, against her protests that she hardly needed such fuss. She was Duchess of Ashcombe by then, a title she still occasionally forgot to answer to when addressed by it directly, though the household staff had long since stopped finding that amusing and simply accepted it as one of her particular charms. The transformation from struggling artist to Duchess had not, in truth, changed her nearly so much as London society had initially expected. She still wore paint-stained aprons over her finer gowns while working. She still argued with her canvases, scraping away passages that displeased her with the same stubborn perfectionism that had once driven her to reject a housemate's dying wish for a hurried, imperfect likeness. She still, on quiet afternoons, walked the mile into the village to visit the small churchyard where Nell's remains had finally been given proper burial the previous summer, moved there from an unmarked Spitalfields grave to rest at last beneath a modest headstone bearing her true name. Eleanor Ashcombe, beloved daughter and sister, remembered. Lord Beaufort remained at Newgate, his health reportedly failing, his name rarely spoken at Ashcombe except in the careful, distant way families spoke of a wound long since closed but never entirely forgotten. Alden had visited him only once, in the months following the trial, and had returned from that visit saying little except that some debts, once incurred, could never properly be repaid, only endured. This particular October morning, Lyra stood before an easel near the largest window, working the last careful strokes into a landscape study of the gardens themselves, the elms beyond the glass turning gold and copper against a pale autumn sky. She had grown, over the past year, considerably more confident in her own voice as a painter, no longer working solely from memory and grief, but from the simple, unguarded pleasure of capturing beauty for its own sake. The estate's changing seasons, the household staff going about their quiet, daily business. Alden himself, caught unawares more than once reading by the library fire, his features rendered with a tenderness she reserved for nothing else in her portfolio. The studio door opened without ceremony, as it always did these days, and Alden entered still in his morning coat, a small stack of correspondence tucked under one arm, though he set it down almost immediately upon the nearest table, as though the letters had suddenly lost whatever urgency they'd carried moments before. "You are meant to be reading dispatches from your steward," Lyra observed, without turning from her canvas, though a smile had already crept into her voice. "The steward's dispatches will keep, this light will not." He crossed the room and came to stand behind her, studying the half-finished landscape over her shoulder, one hand settling lightly at her waist. "You've caught the exact color of those elms. I've walked past them every autumn of my life and never once noticed they turned quite that shade of gold." "You were too busy minding your obligations to notice much of anything, I suspect." an accusation I can no longer properly dispute. He pressed a kiss to the crown of her head, unhurried, entirely at ease in a manner that would have seemed impossible to the stern, suspicious man who had once stormed into her Spitalfields attic with a bailiff and a warrant. Though I find myself considerably better instructed these days, thanks to a rather stubborn teacher. Lyra set down her brush at last and turned in the circle of his arm to face him properly, studying the man who had once seemed to her nothing more than cold, aristocratic authority, and who had become, over the course of a single extraordinary year, the truest companion she had ever known. The grief that had once lived permanently behind his eyes had not vanished entirely. Some sorrows, she had come to understand, simply settled into a person rather than departing altogether. But it sat differently in him now, softened by everything that had grown up around it since. "Do you ever think," she asked quietly, "of how easily none of this might have happened? If your coat had never caught that drop cloth, if I had kept the portrait properly hidden as I always meant to?" "Constantly," Alden admitted. "I think of it more often than I probably should. A single accident of cloth and thread, and I might never have known what became of my sister, might never have learned the truth my uncle spent 15 years burying, might never have found you standing in that doorway refusing to be moved by a duke's warrant." He tucked a loose strand of hair behind her ear, his expression turning thoughtful, almost reverent. "I have come to believe some threads are simply meant to be pulled, Lyra, however accidental the hand that pulls them. Yours pulled mine free of a life I did not even know had gone cold around me until you arrived to warm it." Outside the studio's glass walls, the autumn wind stirred the golden elms into gentle motion, scattering a few loose leaves across the garden path below. Lyra leaned into her husband's embrace, the unfinished landscape forgotten for the moment on its easel, and thought of the frightened, defiant seamstress who had once stood her ground in a cold Spitalfields attic, never once imagining that the very man come to seize her studio would, within a single turning year, become the truest home she had ever found.